Hi again. We're on page 135 of Christianity and the Social Crisis by Rauschenbusch. His chapter, Social Impetus of Primitive Christianity. He's just been dealing with the impact of this new hope upon Gentiles, mostly, it would seem, the poor among the early Christian churches, the women, the agitation it might have caused, the liberation of women from their traditional mores, and then even the influence upon the married in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 in terms of their expectation about the goal of marriage, and but even potentially the celibate tendency that's of course very strong in the medieval church. Where did it come from? Well, apparently there were those in the early Corinthian congregation who felt that marriage had to now be placed on a higher plateau than it had been in their Gentile backdrop. So here, now, Paul and Rauschenbusch address the issue of the impact this might have had, the new hope might have had upon slaves. Rauschenbusch says, we catch a glimpse, too, of a new stirring among the Christian slaves. In discussing the question whether Christians ought to sever marriages with heathen, Paul sets up the general principle that a Christian can be a Christian in any outward set of circumstances, and that he ought to remain in that condition in which the call of God found him. In that connection, he turns to address the slaves. Were you a slave when you were called? Do not let that trouble you. Nay, even if you have the chance to gain your freedom, prefer to remain as you are. For he that was called to be a Christian while a slave is henceforth a freed man of the Lord. Likewise, he that was called in freedom is henceforth the slave of Christ. That's all from 1 Corinthians 7:17 to 24. And from Ephesians 6:5 to 9. Evidently, there were Christian slaves who were troubled by their servile status. They were dependent on the permission of their masters for their right to be Christians at all. They were liable to be commanded to perform immoral or idolatrous acts, and they had no legal right to refuse. But Paul's argument indicates that the cause of unrest lay even deeper, in a newly awakened sense of dignity and human worth. How could a soul belonging to Christ still bend to the yoke of man? Paul says it can be done. The Christian slave is spiritually free in Christ, and that ought to content him. Let him wear the badge of slavery with that inward sense of emancipation. There are other passages in the New Testament touching on the relations of Christian slaves to their masters. In heathen literature, the commonest vice of slaves was stealing. The most serious danger of Christian slaves, apparently, was the independence and aggressiveness begotten of a new sense of equality and worth. Especially if their masters were also their brethren in Christ, the moral problem thereby created was not always satisfactorily solved. Here he references Ephesians 6:5 to 9, 1 Peter 2:18 to 25, and 1 Timothy 6:1 and 2. We'll put those references in the description. We have already touched on the views taken by Christians about the Roman Empire. These theoretical views were sure to manifest themselves, at least occasionally, in practical conduct. Christians were citizens of a higher kingdom. The empire was not their highest good. It was soon to come to naught by God's hand. Its laws were not to them the supreme laws, nor in any sense identical with the moral law. They were often placed in a position where it was their religious duty to disobey the commands of the public officers. Even Paul, who takes so respectful an attitude toward the moral value of government, had no real use for the state so far as Christians were concerned. He did not think of trying to bring Christian influences to bear on the state, but neither did he want any influence of the state in the affairs of Christians. If brethren had trouble between them, they were not to begin litigation before the courts of the empire, but to settle by the arbitration of other brethren, according to 1 Corinthians 6:1 to 11. Christians withdrew from the surrounding heathen life and minimized all contact with it. This involved that they had to reproduce and parallel the necessary institutions of society within their own community. The churches legislated for their members and exercised judicial functions, enforcing them with various grades of disciplinary punishments. In heathen life, the religious and civil organizations were one. The offices of the state, as such, performed the public religious acts. Through the hostile relation of the Christian church and the heathen state, which continued for nearly 3 centuries, the church developed a permanent organization of its own, which controlled and directed the lives of its members with a pressure often more insistent and searching than that of the state. The church was, in fact, a state within the state. The ecclesiastical courts and the canon law of later times were an outgrowth of this situation. It was the realization of this which finally roused the empire to active hostility against the church. There were only 2 persecutions in which the empire took the initiative and exerted its vast strength to destroy the church, the one beginning in AD 250 and the other in AD 303, each lasting about 10 years. Each of these was directed not against the belief of Christians, but against this all-pervading, tenacious organization which paralleled and rivaled the organization of the empire and seemed to threaten its sovereignty. And I wanted to link to Jacques Ellul's discussion of the transition from this situation just described, the 2 great persecutions that happened just a couple of generations before the empire was officially converted to Christianity. So Ellul's thoughts on that change, that transition. So I'm linking to the first of a series we did on that, the Meditations of Jacques Ellul.